see how much we can cover tonight in another of the four world Gentile kingdoms of Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 8. Of course, the closer we get to what our study is all about, the period between the Testaments, 400 BC down to the time of Christ, the more time we're going to spend on each kingdom. Just a little bit on Assyria and Babylon before, only because they're preparing the way to get down to the kingdoms that really have something to do with Israel after the captivity, as well as when we get right down into the intertestamental period. So that brings us to the Medo-Persian Empire tonight, the Medo-Persian Empire. Old Testament kings and prophets chart would be beneficial because here you're going to have the kings all listed for you in order, along with the spelling. Some of the kings are a little difficult to spell. So when we come down to Medo-Persia, we're primarily concerned with such books as the following. And if you understand Medo-Persian history, it will at least help you in understanding these books. I don't know about you, but I know myself in the past, I found books like Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, difficult books to read and understand when I wasn't familiar with all of the kings, when I wasn't familiar with all of the dates. And I found those to be very difficult, trying to know which one fit in where in Israel's history. So maybe if you've had the same problem or still have the same problem I had in the past, then we can be of some help to you this evening in clearing up a few of the things about the kings and stating things hopefully in a simplified manner. Of course, we're not going into a lot of detail about all of this. If we studied Ezra and Nehemiah, then we'd go into a lot of detail verse by verse to see how they fit in there. But I think that we can sum things up in a simplified form and perhaps emphasize and re-emphasize important points so that as long as you know that, then as far as the Medo-Persian Empire is concerned, you can work your way through successfully books like Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Now we're not going to be looking at a lot at Esther tonight anyway. We'll look whenever we get to the right king. But particularly the book of Ezra, with regard to, as far as we'll get this evening, King Cyrus, Darius the Median, Cambyses, Pseudo-Smyrtus, however far we get. By the time you get down to Darius the First, Hystaspes, and we'll go on into Haggai, Zechariah, as well as Nehemiah. So those books that I mentioned, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, maybe to some degree Ezekiel. Remember, Ezekiel is a prophet who goes over 5 years into the captivity of Jehoiakim, which would put him around 593 BC. He comes during the period of Babylonian captivity, but he's not going to be nearly as important. He's prophesying things that are different than Daniel's prophecies, or he's really got a different type of role, not the statesman's type role that the prophet Daniel has, which is why we're going to be looking a lot at the book of Daniel. So the Medes and the Persians come into play in the first place in 539 BC when they take Babylon. That's their greatest accomplishment as the dual empire. And by the way, it is a dual empire of the Medes, or sometimes they're referred to as the Medians. Either name is correct. The Medes and the Persians. So it's contracted with a hyphen, the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, according to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20, it's a dual kingdom made up of the Medes and the Persians. And according to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 5, the Medes came first, that's why their name is mentioned first, but Persia was actually in control of the kingdom. As a matter of fact, you'll see as we go along, when we get down to the time of Cyrus, Cyrus, who was a Persian, overthrew his Median lord, Astyages, which meant that really the Medes themselves, just like Babylon, the Medes themselves became subject to the nation of Persia. But it's still generally referred to as the Medo-Persian Empire. So in Daniel 8:20, it's set forth that it's dual, and in Daniel 7:5, one's better, one's higher, one's more lifted up, one's in more control, we should say, than the other, and that is Persia over Media. Now, Media comes into the picture a little bit earlier because Nebuchadnezzar actually married a Median princess. And that's why Nebuchadnezzar had to build what was then one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. He built that with his Median princess in mind to remind her of her homeland. She came from a homeland in Media that was lush with green vegetation, and old Babylon in the plain of Shinar was just the opposite of that. And so in order to placate his new wife, the Median princess, then he built the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which I assume we've all heard of before, to remind her of the homeland that she had come from. Now, the Medes came on the scene about 100 years prior to the Persians. Remember, with Assyrian Babylon, we went way back thousands of years. And we weren't just finding a very small beginning. We were finding a large beginning way back several thousand years BC to the Assyrian and to the Babylonian empires. Now, although people might try to trace Medo-Persia back, you really can't. Obviously, you're going to find people that live in what became known later as Media and Persia, but that doesn't mean they were the Medes and the Persians. It's really around 700 BC that Media rises, and then about 100 years later that we see Persia. Media is located right where modern Tehran, Iran, is. If you know where that is, and you know where Media is, and Persia was a little bit south of that, down in southern Iran. Persia was first known as Persis, P-E-R-S-I-S. And it's from Persia that we get our famous stories about the Arabian Nights. All of that allegedly took place in Persia with the genie and Aladdin and his lamp and all of these various things. All of those are Persian stories. A lot of myths and a lot of stories of the occult have originated in ancient Persia, which is where Persia and Media are made up today by the modern state or country of Iran. Now I want to show you here on the overhead where, first of all, where we've just been speaking of, where Media and where Persia are, and then point out a couple of the capitals. Now I know I'm not saying enough yet for you to be able to follow completely, but just remember that although Media comes first, Media is going to actually be overthrown by Persia, even though we're still going to refer to them forevermore after that as the Medo-Persian Empire. Otherwise, you think of them as being a dual kingdom, so that we've got a king that's over Media that's kind of distinct from the king that's over Persia, and these kind of rule together, and both of them are more or less co-regents together with the same amount of power. That's an easy misconception for people to pick up when they're first studying the Bible, because the book of Daniel refers to, as well as books like the book of Esther, the laws of the Medes and the Persians. And most of the time you'll find the name Mede or Media come before Persia. So let's see. We don't have a lot of cities that we need on here, but we do have the general region. You can acclimate yourself. Here's Israel, and here's Egypt down here. This is where Media is found. This general area right here is where it starts. Now, the green is supposed to represent the whole Median Empire, and it really does. It goes up north, it went down south, because like I said, she comes on the scene prior to Persia. Whereas Persia is found right down in this area. This area right here used to be known as Elam, E-L-A-M, and it's referred to by that name in the Old Testament as Elam. That's what Persia took over whenever Persia came on the scene, was Elam, and took over the capital of Elam, Susa. It's also referred to in the Old Testament as Shushan, which became the winter headquarters for the Persian kings. You find that, for instance, mentioned right in the book of Daniel. Let me see if I can find a passage. Like Daniel 8. Well, look in Daniel 8, because it gives us the name Elam here as well. Daniel 8 and verse 2. Daniel says, I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was, he's going to tell us where he was. Now, we all think of, well, we know where Daniel was. Daniel was right over here in Babylon. No, he wasn't. Now he's going to tell us he was over here in Susa, or Shushan. Just another name for the same thing. I was at Shushan, in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And that's what this was known, this little section right here. Persia really goes all the way over here and extends down this way. As a matter of fact, you see the Gulf was named after the state, the Persian Gulf. But then Persia eventually took over Elam, as well as what was officially Persia to begin with, and took over Susa, or Shushan. He said, I saw in a vision, and I was by a river Ulai, which evidently is a small river because it's really not known. Okay, what's this right here? Magmetha. What's that? We just talked about that recently. Well, that, first of all, was the capital of Media. Now, when the Persians take over, they take over that as their capital. They end up with about, well, 4 capitals. I'm going to only give you 3 because 3 are the most important. Well, Ezra chapter 6 and verse 2 in your margin. We just mentioned this, I forget where it was, but it just was a few days ago, or a week or so at the most. Agmetha. You see, there's the old name there, Agmetha, and we gave you the better name, Ecbatana. Ecbatana. This is the same as Ecbatana. Ecbatana was the capital of Media. Susa was the capital of Elam, which the Persians took over and made the winter headquarters for the king. Now they used this as well because it was a famous city, Ecbatana. As a matter of fact, Cyrus captured the city. Cyrus the First, or Cyrus the Great, captured the city and took all of its treasures away. But the chief capital to remember with regard to Persia is Persepolis. It got its name from the old name of Persia, which I said was Persis, P-E-R-S-I-S, which is not on the map, but it's found down in this general area. It may even be a little bit off the map over this direction. Persepolis, one of the great, great cities of the ancient world. As a matter of fact, Alexander was the one who put the torch to the city and burned it to the ground, but many, many columns and remains are in existence today. It's probably the most famous tourist attraction in that part of Iran today, or in ancient Persia. It's the most famous tourist attraction are the extant remains of the great, great, fabulously rich capital of the Persians known as Persepolis. I really need something else up there after I've shown you that, because we're going to, well, I need more than I've got on one map is what I need. I tell you what, there's what I need right there. I'll put this on whenever I need it. I'll leave that on for a moment and you can get yourself used to it, because we're going to start taking some trips here. We're going to end up down in Egypt. We're going to end up off the map over here as far as we can go in Asia Minor, which was a province known as Lydia. We'll get there in a moment. But anyway, forget about the way Median Empire looks up here. Really, we're going to locate it right over in this area. The Median Empire and the Persian Empire, for the most part, is due south of it. Remember, we're talking about them. They're taking over Babylon. Babylon falls in October of 539 B.C. Here's Babylon. That means they're going to take over this whole territory, as well as Israel, because, of course, Israel was controlled by Babylon at this time. So if you take over the one who's taken over Israel, then you get all of the spoils of that country, which means that you get Israel as well. So there's a little bit of the early history, a little bit of the geography of Media and Persia. Historically speaking, in the Bible, the first time we really see Medo-Persia come into action is in the last few verses of Daniel chapter 5. So you may want to turn over there, because we're going to be looking on and off. We're going to be flipping on and off into the book of Daniel and back out over into the book of Ezra. But Daniel chapter 5, especially the last 2 verses, but you have to take verse 28 to have both of the countries mentioned by name, the Medes and the Persians, or the citizens of the country, the Medes and the Persians of Media and Persia. Daniel chapter 5, verses 25 to 31, particularly verse 28 and verses 30 and 31. Now what happens here is the fall of Babylon, which we'll get to describe here in a moment. This had been predicted by Daniel over in chapter 8 and verse 20, a long time before it has even taken place. Don't think that Daniel 8 chronologically comes after chapter 5, because it doesn't. The last few chapters here in Daniel, once you get over here to chapter 6 onward, then you've got things that are not in chronological order. It starts off in order with the reign of Nebuchadnezzar in the first 4 chapters. Then you've got Belshazzar. Then you skip chapter 6 to Darius, and then I think chapter 7 you go back to Belshazzar, so it's skipping around a little bit. Well, like we've done with the other kingdoms so far, the best way to study the kingdoms is according to their leaders. So for that you can look on your chart. We're going to start looking at the leaders of the Medo-Persian Empire, which will give you a history for its foundations and how they interact with Israel in her history in the Old Testament. The best way to look at this is to follow the line of the kings. Now you might want, first of all, to notice, I think you're only going to have 2 Median kings on here. The 2 Median kings aren't that important. They're not found in the Bible. One of them starts, well, you can see 625, the Median kings start, with Cyrus. And I doubt we'll even get to mentioning him. But 585 to 550 is only the second of the 2 Median kings mentioned here. Astyages. And Astyages becomes important because he's going to be defeated by Cyrus, which switches the power in this dual kingdom from the Medes to the Persians, although it's still referred to as the Medo-Persian Empire. Before this, they were more or less joined together. Well, they were joined together, but the Medes were in control. Remember, the Medes were one of the 2 groups that had joined forces with Babylon to overthrow Nineveh in 612. You don't read anything about the Persians there. It's the Medes. Why? Well, the Medes came on the scene earlier than did the Persians. But when we get down to the Achaemenid line of the Persian kings, then we really get into biblical Old Testament history. So we'll come back maybe and make a comment as we go along. But we're going to start with the Achaemenid line of Persian kings, which begins with Cyrus, sometimes referred to as Cyrus the Great or Cyrus the First. One of ancient history's most benevolent, kindly, goodly kings. He was a good king, as we'll see. We look at his references in the Old Testament. Now the origin of Cyrus is not known. His father's name was Cambyses the First, or the earlier Cambyses. Don't confuse him with the king that comes after Cyrus, though, because that Cambyses is an important one. But they happen to have the same name, the father of Cyrus and the king who comes after Cyrus. And like I just said, the Medians were confederate, along with the Scythians and Babylon, in overthrowing the Assyrians in the Battle of Nineveh in 612 BC. And yet, we're talking, you have to think along this line, if the Medes were confederate, were allies with Babylon in overthrowing Nineveh, then why don't we end up with the Medo-Babylonian Empire then? Well, right after that, there was a falling out between Cyrus, the first king that we mentioned, who really started, I think, right around the same time as Nabopolassar, the beginning of the height of Median power here towards the end of the 7th century BC, just happens to parallel and correspond with the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar. And so there was a falling out between Nabopolassar and Cyaxares. Some people have even suggested that Cyaxares was the one who led the assault against Nineveh, although the official king of the whole empire was the king of Babylon, Nabopolassar, and the commander-in-chief of the forces that attacked Nineveh was his son, Nebuchadnezzar. And assuming that's true, then maybe there is the origin for some of the friction that would have caused a parting of the Medes from the Babylonians, which would present us now with the confederate of the Medes and the Persians, rather than the Medes and the Babylonians. But be that as it may, whether we know or don't know why there was a separation with this alliance of the Medians and the Babylonians, the Medes do end up with the Persians with this dual empire, as set forth not only in history, that is the extra-biblical records, but in the book of Daniel as well. So let's come to King Cyrus, Cyrus the Great, Cyrus the First. At his father's death, Cyrus around 560, Cyrus was appointed a small portion of the Persian Empire, which really wasn't an empire to any extent. It was just a small geographical spot, a region, just a small little speck on the map at the time. But anyway, it had been divided up after the death of the earlier Cambyses, and part of the kingdom, or part of the little geographical domain referred to as Persia, was received by the son of the earlier Cambyses, and that's the Cyrus that we have reference to. And yet this whole time, we're around 560 now. You have to keep your chart in front of you and kind of follow along there. This whole time, around 560, the Medes are still in control of the dual empire. And Cyrus decides to put an end to this around 9 years after he had first taken over part of his father's former geographical region, where in 550, Cyrus revolts against Astyages, who was his Median overlord. He revolts against Astyages in 550, thus taking Nineveh and sacking the capital of Acmetha, as you see on the overhead, or preferably Ecbatana. So he takes the city, he takes the country, and so we're going to have some major changes take place now as the balance of power shifts from the Medes to the Persian in the self-same dual empire. Now about this same time, Nabonidus, or really a little bit earlier, Nabonidus, who is king in Babylon. Now we're still, 11 years before the fall of Babylon. So we're not getting down there to Babylon's fall yet. We're still a little bit before that. All we're talking about is the beginning of the Achaemenid line of Persian kings, which is going to bring someone on the scene who's strong enough to take Babylon. Astyages wasn't, but Cyrus the Great will be. But just a few years before Cyrus revolts against Astyages, his Median overlord, Nabonidus, who's this king in Babylon. Remember we talked about him last time. He's interesting because he's not mentioned in Scripture. The book of Daniel portrays that the last king of Babylon was one Belshazzar, whereas the records show that the last king of Babylon was Nabonidus. Well, we pointed out where you could draw a line and connect the two facts. It seemed like they couldn't exist side by side. You can't have a last king that's Nabonidus and a last king that's Belshazzar. Well, the official king was Nabonidus. But Nabonidus had a penchant for archaeological discovery. And he didn't like to rule. He didn't like to sit on the throne. He liked to run around and dig up skeletons, and he really did. He liked to go around and do little amateur archaeological digs. And so in order to get out from all of the administration and the control that he was needed to preside over in Babylon, he appointed his son Belshazzar. Now you see Belshazzar appears numerous times in the book of Daniel, such as all of Daniel chapter 5 is about Belshazzar. So just a little bit before Cyrus takes over from Astyages, that Nabonidus more or less abdicates the throne in Babylon to go on his mystic archaeological hunts, and he appoints his son Belshazzar. This is going to become important, as we will see in the book of Daniel, to sit on the throne so that he can do his travels. Now, the first thing that Cyrus does, here, Cyrus, king of Persia, we just have to keep reviewing because I can't tell if I'm talking too slow or too fast or whatever. But he's going to take over Astyages, who has his capital here, Acmetha, or Ecbatana. And of course, what everyone's wanting to get, since you're not Babylon, he's not part of Babylon, and Babylon's the controlling force of the world of that day, you're going to obviously want to take Babylon. But you don't start there. Babylon's too great. It was thought of as being an impregnable city at this time. So he starts down here with his capital of Persepolis. He takes Elam. More or less, Elam had already been absorbed into the empire by 550 BC. But he goes up here and he takes Astyages, his Median overlord, which gives him this general area right here. Again, you can forget about this. A lot of this really was controlled by Babylon, whenever you're getting all the way up here into the highland plateaus of Armenia. But all of this area right here now is controlled by Persia. So as any good military commander will do, the first thing you do is start fortifying your borders, fortifying the extents of your kingdom. And so he goes eastwardly. This has become important because he's going to take off in another direction and get everything prepared before he's going to come back and make an attempt on Babylon. So he goes all the way over here to what's now Pakistan. And he fortifies his eastern border. This is the first thing that he does once he takes Astyages. Then after he has been successful in fortifying the eastern border, he can't come through Babylon. All this is still controlled by Nabonidus, who's running around digging up skeletons, and really it's controlled by Belshazzar, who's his son, co-regent on the throne in Babylon. So he goes all the way up this way, and for that I'm going to have to put another map on. to show you where he goes next, it's remarkable how far he goes. And this is going to become very important. Not tonight. Whenever we start studying the Greek Empire, then this will all come into play, because the Persians and the Greeks are a long, long way from one another. How do they ever get tangled up in these big battles of the Battle of Marathon and the Battle of Salamis, which are very important for Greek history, because had the Greeks not been successful there, then Alexander the Great never would have come on the scene and been so successful afterwards, and perhaps Persia would have been the controlling force in the world, and it would have been the Persian tongue and language rather than the Greek, Persian customs and mythology rather than Greek philosophies that would have spread all over the world. So we've got to have an introduction of the Persians to the Greeks, and this is what we're going to have. So way off the map over here now is Persia. And so Cyrus the Great comes up here. We don't have a river on here. The river is Halys, the Halys River. It comes right down here. This is, well, here it's marked down here. This is Cappadocia. This was ancient Cappadocia. We're back now 500 B.C., whereas this right here is about 50 A.D. So we're a half a millennium earlier than when this map was drawn. This is Cappadocia. The Halys River comes down right here. And what he's coming for is a king by the name of Croesus. C-R-O-E-S-U-S. Croesus. What did you just say? Yeah, that's a popular saying. Fabulously, fabulously rich. C-R-O-E-S-U-S. I was fixing to say that. Evidently someone's heard the saying. If you say you're as rich as Croesus, that means you're as rich as this ancient king. And see, a lot of people say things, and you could give them a little lesson in Persian history, which would probably shock them. Because you learn a little nursery rhyme like a stitch in time saves 9, and you really don't know anything about the origins of it. Well, he's coming for Croesus. That's where he's coming. And Croesus is going for him because all of this region right here is controlled by the king of Lydia, whose name is Croesus. He had been building up his wealth, building up his power under the leaders that came before him for a long, long time. And of course, he's just across the Aegean Sea from mainland Greece, which is going to become very, very important in Persian history shortly hereafter. So he crosses over the Halys River. He comes down somewhere in this general area, and in a series of 3 battles, the first 2 are rather indecisive. The final battle, Cyrus takes Croesus, for the most part, thereby taking Lydia. He doesn't get the king. The king runs off and I think locks himself up in some city. And I forget whether they ever got to him or not, but the important thing is he was successful. Cyrus was successful in doing what? Well, we'd already talked about him fortifying his eastern border. Now what he's trying to do is fortify this western border against the Greeks. The Greeks haven't come on the scene as being as strong as they're going to be shortly hereafter. But that's the next power to watch out for is Greece. And of course you know that from history. This is going to be the next power that comes on the scene after the Medes and the Persians. So Cyrus is very, very intelligent, very good king, very good leader, very good military commander, very good schemer and planner and tactician because he's thinking of these things. And so the city of Ephesus, the city of Miletus, you see you're familiar with that from New Testament Pauline travels. Both of these fall to Cyrus. They've both been controlled in this general area here known as Lydia. Croesus had a famous cavalry unit. He sent out his multitude of horses against Cyrus, and the way Cyrus overcame that, he set a whole line of camels out in front of his men. And these horses had never seen camels before. And they panicked. Whenever they panicked, they, of course, threw the riders off, and that was the final and the third decisive battle that allowed Cyrus to overcome Croesus, which is important because now he's going to fortify this western border. Once he's fortified the western border by defeating Croesus, king of Lydia, then he takes his trip back home to Persepolis in Persia. So after this battle, he travels back to the east, and now for the first time sets his eyes on Babylon. He's got the eastern frontier fortified and settled over in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. He's got the western border fortified over in western Turkey of today. And so now he begins to concentrate all of his attention and all of his plans on Babylon, because Babylon is still in control of the world. Now, like I said, Nabonidus, meanwhile, back in Babylon, was really not a good king because he never stayed in Babylon. He liked to run around, as I said, travel around and do his archaeological digs, and behind him he left his son Belshazzar, who, for instance, in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1, is mentioned as Belshazzar the king. Well, he was king because his father Nabonidus was never there. Now remember, this is one of the chief critical problems with the book of Daniel, is how can Belshazzar be king when really we know Nabonidus was king? Well, they were both king. They were co-regents, father and son. But who was at Babylon? Well, definitely Belshazzar. Just the historical records of the inclinations of Nabonidus show us that he never could have stayed around Babylon very long at all. This is one of the chief critical problems with the book of Daniel, is how can Belshazzar be king when really we know Nabonidus was king? Well, they were both king. They were co-regents, father and son. But who was at Babylon? Well, definitely Belshazzar. Just the historical records of the inclinations of Nabonidus show us that he never could have stayed around Babylon very long at all. One thing that Nabonidus didn't like, he didn't like the patron deity Marduk of Babylon. As a matter of fact, one thing that outraged the citizens of Babylon was that whenever any type of calamity was impending, whether it was maybe an attack on some frontier post by a foreign army, or perhaps a famine or whatever, a great storm or whatever, that he'd run around to the different cities in Babylon and collect the little statues and idols of all types of other deities and bring those back to the great, great temple of Marduk in Babylon, which outraged not only the official priests of Marduk, but all the people of Babylon, because that was the patron deity of the city. And that's why, well, we haven't gotten that far, but whenever we get to the fall of Babylon, it really wasn't any struggle for the city to fall. Why? Because Cyrus came in more as a liberator than a conqueror. And that's what the people thought of him as whenever he came in. You're setting us free from this Nabonidus, who's really not our leader, who's really not in control here, which we'll get to here in a moment. So in October of 539, you see here we happen to have it pinned down even to the month, October, towards the end of October, 539 BC. The attack plans are made final concerning Cyrus taking Babylon. Meanwhile, we have to throw another hitch into the story. Nabonidus, who was the amateur archaeologist running around with Belshazzar, his son, in Babylon, Nabonidus had a very, very good general whose name was Gobryas, G-O-B-R-Y-A-S. G-O-B-R-Y-A-S, Gobryas, who was better known as Gubaru. Well, that's his name. I can't help it, and probably he couldn't either. G-U-B-A-R-U, Gubaru. This was a very good general in the forces of Babylon and their king Nabonidus. And just about this time, maybe a year or so prior to when we're talking about, October 539 BC, we have a desertion of Gubaru over to the forces of the Persians and King Cyrus, which was a major problem, a major stumbling block now, not only for Nabonidus, but Belshazzar, who's the one who has to stay in the city and who's the one who ends up dead rather than his father Nabonidus, because Belshazzar was the one of the two kings who stayed in Babylon and who was there whenever the city fell. Now, Babylon was thought to be impregnable at this time. The military scouts that had come back, reporting back to Cyrus, gave descriptions of the city, and this is true to life, true to detail, the city was so huge and so fantastic that all of the crops that were needed for, as well as the livestock, of the whole population of the city, as well as all the surrounding areas. See, whenever a country was attacked, that a lot of people didn't live in the city, they lived outside the city walls. But whenever the city or that area is attacked, then everyone flees their home, their little village or whatever, to make sure you can get inside the walls of the city. Now, I don't know if you realize that happens, but that happens throughout the Old Testament with Jerusalem. Whenever the outlying districts are attacked, then the Israelites make sure they get inside the walls of Jerusalem because they were so thick and so high. So it was said, and as far as we can tell from the remains of Babylon, and by the way, there are remains of the ancient city of Babylon, the city was so huge in circumference that it had just acres and acres where you could raise all types of crops and all types of livestock, so that you could keep your people fed and nourished for months and months and months, if not years and years. Of course, you could store up the grain and so forth whenever the city was under siege and was under attack. You say, well, that satisfies food. What about water? Well, the very river Euphrates flowed in one portion of the city underneath the walls of the city of Babylon and out the other side. So that gave you all the water that you could possibly need. The whole river Euphrates flowed right under the city. That's how big Babylon was. And it takes care of the food because you've got so much room that all the crops can be grown, the livestock raised, and whatever else you need. So it takes care of food, takes care of water. The walls are not only thick but high. It was thought to be an impregnable city, but not impregnable for Cyrus the thinker, Cyrus the Great. Do you remember whenever we talked about Assyrian Babylon, that a river came into play with the fall of Nineveh? The Tigris River. They caused the river to actually flood the city out, which in effect flooded the people right out of the city, and that was how they were able to take Nineveh. Well, it just so happens that on a second occasion, the city wasn't flooded out, but the river, not Tigris, now Euphrates, and not Nineveh, now Babylon, becomes very important in another military exploit in history. And what Cyrus decided to do was, we'll stop the Euphrates River. Easier said than done, but it was a good idea anyway. But better than stop it, of course you can't do that, the water's got to go somewhere. We'll divert the course of the river. How are you going to divert that? Well, throughout this area around Babylon, interconnecting with the Euphrates River, were various canals. Turn over, for instance, to the book of Ezekiel. Give your head a kick with your neighbor's foot and see if you can dislodge from your memory something we said a long time ago when we studied Ezekiel and OTI. Ezekiel is held captive in a certain place, and he's over in Babylon. Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 1. It came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar. What did we say about that phrase? It was a canal. It's not a river. Chebar is not a river. It was just one of the interconnecting canals. You see, we're talking about a whole level plain of Shinar here. And all these canals had been dug off in all different directions from the Euphrates River. Why? Well, obviously to irrigate crops and so forth. And that's exactly what Chebar is. It's one of the canals. It's not a river like you would think of a river, Euphrates or Tigris. And then it's mentioned again over in chapter 3 and verse 15. He's at this place called Tel Abib that's on the river, or the canal, of Chebar. So you can see what I'm leading up to and what Cyrus thought of. There's so many of these canals around here, all it's going to take maybe is just digging the canal a little wider and a little deeper, and we'll divert the course, because sometimes the canal would be a connecting one. It would come off from the side of the river, go out maybe 10 miles or 5 or however far, and then come right back and connect to the river again. That way you're going to irrigate a whole half circle, a whole semicircle of territory. So, if Babylon happens to be located on the Euphrates River between connection 1 and connection 2, well, you can see what's happening. All you're going to have to do is get the water to go in that, let's say, that canal of Chebar, or any canal. Divert the water of Euphrates into that canal, and what are you going to have? A dry riverbed that goes right underneath the walls of Babylon, which is how the city was taken. You see, that's why he was king and you weren't, or I wasn't. Because you wouldn't think of something like that. Well, how are you going to get your men over a wall like that? Well, we could camp out there for the next 15 years, and probably then some, because remember how much food and water they have in there. Well, we'll just cut the water supply off Euphrates River, and they'll die of thirst sooner or later. Well, I'm sure there were untold wells all over the place. I mean, all you got to do whenever you get next to a river is just dig a little bit in the ground, and you're going to find a water source there. You just find that around the lake or a river or anything else like that, especially a river. So that's not going to work. But what would work is if we can divert the course, have the riverbed dry up, we'll march a whole army right underneath the wall. There'll be nothing to stop us except oncoming soldiers from the city of Babylon, which is exactly what he did. And in chapter 5, turn back to the book of Daniel. Here's the fall of Babylon, October 539. And remember, this had been prophesied, for instance, way back in the early chapters of the book of Isaiah, where Isaiah is prophesying that great Babylon is going to fall and become a habitation of those doleful creatures, satyrs, all of these strange monsters, demons, the ostriches and so forth that we studied earlier in creation, that were going to become the permanent inhabitants of the ruins of Babylon. And they're still over there today. But what's interesting about Daniel chapter 5 is the total absence of a battle. We don't have a battle here. And you think, great, Babylon's not going to fall without a fight. Well, when you understand how it fell, you can understand how it fell without a fight. She was defenseless. Whenever you got a whole army of the Persians and the Medes marching underneath the wall from both directions, you don't have any defenses then. Your hopes are gone. And besides that, the people weren't so concerned. They knew what type of king Cyrus was. And they looked upon Cyrus, as I said earlier, more as the deliverer, as a liberator, than as a conqueror, because of the affairs of Nabonidus. So let's look in Daniel chapter 5, verse 25. This is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing that was written. Mene, so forth. Tekel, so forth. Peres, verse 28, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now you know this is happening with Daniel in the court of Belshazzar whenever they had the handwriting on the wall. He wrote this phrase, verse 25, Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. He called all of his soothsayers, magicians, astrologers, the wise men, those who studied the magical arts of Babylon before him, that is Belshazzar, and no one could give him the proper interpretation of Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. But Daniel can. And Daniel tells them, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now you got to remember that. This is taking place October 539 BC. And it's not like Daniel's looking over the wall to find out, well, what's really going to happen out there. Although, of course, when you know the history of Babylon, you know that all this has already taken place here. A lot of times people just read Daniel. By the way, it's going to happen the same night that Daniel's talking about this. You can't dry the river up in one night. That was over a process of time. As a matter of fact, let me mention another thing about Daniel 5 before we go on. You know this great drunken feast that Belshazzar has? Why did he have a drunken feast like that? Except, you know, whenever you're going down, sometimes the best way to go out is drunk. And so he has this whole drunken brawl with all of these lords. 1,000 of his lords, verse 1. Because all of this is happening on one day, or one evening really, because it's nighttime when this happens. And if all of this is really true that I've been telling you about the fall of Babylon, the diverting of the course of the Euphrates and so forth, that would have been known for weeks, if not months, prior to Daniel chapter 5. Everyone could look over the wall and see what's going on out there. So Belshazzar decides to go out the right way. It doesn't look like he's really up for much of a fight himself, although, as we'll see, he puts up at least a minor skirmish here. So verse 29. I mean, that's as good a hypothesis as anyone can give you about Daniel 5. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck, made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, that won't do much good when your kingdom is going down. But see, if you don't know that, then you read that, you get a false interpretation of the end of the verse. Because look at verse 30, in that night. In that night. Now don't let it bother you that, well, I thought that all this was great prophecy. Daniel was predicting things he couldn't have known otherwise. Well, look at the rest of the book. He's predicting all types of things that he couldn't have known otherwise. So just because one time he happened to be blessed with some first-hand rather than supernatural information, that doesn't in any regard cast some reflection on his ministry or his prophetic capabilities and his position. In that night was Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, slain. Now remember, Belshazzar is only second, really, in control. And by the way, I'm thinking of something else. Why did he appoint Daniel third ruler? Unless we've got someone else in there, namely his father, Nabonidus. You see, it fits together without me even thinking about it. It fits together. Yeah, you had to think about that. Third ruler, well, Belshazzar, Daniel, 3-3. Who, me? Who's the other one? Ezekiel? No. It's Nabonidus. But you see, you won't find his name anywhere in Scripture. You got to open up a Sunday school quarterly to find that. In the table of contents or the glossary of terms, probably. That night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Now, this is only hypothesis, but probably what we've got here in verse 30. I mean, why is Belshazzar killed? No one else is killed. We don't even have a battle here. Not even, shall we say, a bullet fired in this whole thing about Babylon falling. Probably Belshazzar locked himself up in some citadel. He, along with some of his other lords or captains or whatever, maybe tried to fight it out a little bit, and that's why whenever the citadel was finally taken, then Belshazzar was as well. That's only hypothesis, though. No one knows. But it's interesting that he was killed and no one else was. Then verse 31, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, which is a problematic text we'll have to come back to. Anyway, we're still talking about Cyrus. Now, Cyrus is not here on the scene. Cyrus is taking care of other matters. That's why we have the name of Darius the Mede mentioned in verse 31. But later on here in this very same month, really it's not the same month, it's within a month of time, but it would have to be November of 539, Cyrus makes his first appearance in the city of Babylon, and he is shouted upon by all the people because they're so glad to see such a good king finally come and reign over them. And this Darius the Median is appointed as a satrap over this particular part of the empire of Cyrus. All right, let's give you some more information about Cyrus before we go on, or before we stop, depending on which happens first. I said before that Cyrus was known, and still is known, in world history as one of the most benevolent kings that have ever existed, one of the world's most humane monarchs. And we actually have this picture of him from the Old Testament. You remember whenever Babylon conquered people, such as Israel, what did Babylon do with the captives? Babylon took the good captives over into Babylon. What about Assyria? Whenever Assyria conquered a people, what did Assyria do? Three different things. Many of the people were simply slaughtered because of the cruel methods of the Assyrians. Again, some of the people were taken over into Assyria, taken as captives. You read that again right in your Old Testament. There were captives taken from the northern 10 tribes whenever Samaria and Israel fell in 722 BC. The third place, Assyria did really another thing in addition to what Babylon did later on. She moved foreign people in to the area that she had just taken, which is going to give us the origins for the history of the people known as the Samaritans. She takes the Israelites out and puts them somewhere else. And then just to really make sure nothing ever starts up there again, as far as a revolt against you or your king or your kingdom, you bring foreigners in. And we read in the Old Testament that Assyria brought foreigners from places like Babylon, which wasn't the mighty power now that it becomes with Nabopolassar in 625 BC, into northern Israel to occupy, to intermingle, to intermix, to intermarriage with the few Israelites from the northern kingdom that are left there. Cyrus, we saw what Babylon did, we saw what Assyria did. What about the Persians? Well, good old kindly Cyrus, he doesn't take anyone captive. As a matter of fact, whenever Cyrus took over a realm, he let the captives go. And you know, this is exactly what we have predicted and prophesied in the Old Testament. For instance, if you turn back to the prophecies of Isaiah, chapters 44 and 45, we see from Scripture that this wasn't just some inborn natural benevolence in the heart of Cyrus. You don't generally find monarchs like that. But when you're controlled by the Lord God Almighty, and he has a purpose not only for you, but through you for his people, then he can do anything. So in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, we're talking now long before the days of Cyrus. When's Isaiah prophesying? Anyone remember? When's the beginning? 739. Okay, 739 BC. So we're talking about a century and a half before the time of Cyrus. Look at the last verse of Isaiah 45. I know I'm talking quickly, but that's why we've got magnetic tapes today, so you can hear it again. But if I slow down too much, sometimes I confuse myself, because then I have to look down at my notes. If I can just talk from memory, then I can string it all together. Now, that may sound just the opposite, but that's generally the way I can teach the best, is to have the less to look at, and I just try to remember it all. Verse 28, that say of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure. Even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. Now that's not significant until you realize Cyrus wasn't born until a century and a half later. And Isaiah is calling him out by name, telling us what the divine, heavenly given mission of the king of the Persians, Cyrus, is going to be. It looks like it has something to do with the restoration of the exiles. That's why Cyrus in history is known as one of the most humane, benevolent kings of all time. His clemency was known abroad. So whenever he took Babylon, what did he do? He gave all the people who had been taken captive, and Israel was only one, remember, of several different groups of people who had been taken captive into Babylon. He allowed any of them who wanted to go back home. Look in chapter 45. First few verses here, still talking about Cyrus. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden. Now Cyrus wasn't charismatic Christian or anything like that. He was a pagan monarch. But you see, God has the power to just overrule in your life, your heart. What did he do to old Pharaoh? He just got him to the point that Pharaoh let his people go. And then what did God do? God got him to the point where he was mad that he let them go. Why did he do that? So he said, so I could get honor from Pharaoh's destruction, as well as the whole nation of Israel. And it's done many times. What about Nebuchadnezzar? Last few verses of Daniel chapter 4, did Nebuchadnezzar become a believer? Some people think that he did, because he repented and said, the Most High ruleth in the kingdoms of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whoever lifts himself up, exalts himself, God is able to abase. He said, I extol and praise the Most High God. Was Nebuchadnezzar converted? Well, certainly not. He just had a little first-hand information of what a mighty hand God can lay upon you if you ever did anything against him. And so Cyrus doesn't have to go through all the horrors, the beastly horrors that Nebuchadnezzar did. Nebuchadnezzar was sent out from the children of men, remember, until his fingernails grew like birds' claws, until his understanding returned to him, which again is supernatural. But anyway, it's prepared aforetime for King Cyrus to be the type of king that he is. To subdue nations before him. Well, what about Media? We talked about Media. What about Lydia? We talked about Lydia. And most of all, Babylon. And I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. All this is interesting prophecy. I'll go before thee, make the crooked places straight. I'll break in pieces the gates of brass, and cut in sunder the bars of iron. I will give thee the treasures of darkness, and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, which called thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. All of this has to do with Israel, not just with Cyrus. People say, well, that's unfair for God to use Cyrus for his own purposes. Well, he uses everything for his own purposes. It looks pretty selfish, but it is. Verse 4, for Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I've even called thee by thy name. Well, we read it in verse 28, verse 1. And surnamed thee, that is, as his anointed, thou that hast not known me. Cyrus is not a converted Jew or something. I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me. Twice. I'm emphasizing that because I've heard people erroneously state in the past that such people as Nebuchadnezzar ended up being a believer, or at least partially a believer. You remember the passage I'm talking about? Turn over to Daniel 4. In case you don't. Some of you do, but not everyone does. Well, we could read a lot, verse 34 through verse 37. But look at the last verse. I quoted most of it before. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. All his works are truth and his ways judgment. He's singing the song of Moses there. And those that walk in pride he is able to abase. He knew because he did and God did. So you say, well, Nebuchadnezzar got the praise message there, praising God, extolling, honoring the King of heaven. Well, what else can you do? You don't want to go out and be an animal for the next 7 years like you just were prior to that. So it's best to praise God while you have any breath left in you. So he's not converted, neither is Cyrus. Back to Isaiah 45. Twice you have not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun. And by the way, we've sung this in a song before. It's not talking about God saving charismatic Christians or something. It's talking about what we're talking about, the Medo-Persian Empire. You didn't know. We sing songs in our church about the Medes and the Persians. Well, I dare say there's some people right here in this church who didn't know you were singing songs about King Cyrus. Thought you were talking about God saving you and so forth. Well, we're included because from the rising of the sun, from the west, he said, I want everyone to know this, that there is none beside me. I am the Lord and there is none else. Well, who could bring a king? I mean, ancient monarchs just weren't like Cyrus. You didn't take over a kingdom and pay the people to leave, which is what Cyrus did. Remember, whenever they went back, he gave them all those gold and silver treasures. You don't do that in your right mind as a heathen monarch. Verse 7, I form the light, create darkness. I make peace, create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. So you have to understand some of that difficult portion of the 7th verse in light of the context, you see. Drop down, ye heavens, from above, and let the skies pour down righteousness. Let the earth open. Let them bring forth salvation, and let righteousness spring up together. I, the Lord, have created it. Woe unto him that striveth with his Maker. So Cyrus better not do that. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, Why makest thou, or what makest thou? Or thy work, he hath no hands. Who unto him that saith unto his father, Woe unto him that saith unto his father, What begettest thou? Or to the woman, What hast thou brought forth? Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker, Ask me of things to come concerning my sons. Well, he's talking about the prophecy of Israel being restored after the exile. And concerning the work of my hands, command ye me. Amen. What does Daniel do over in Daniel chapter 9? He looks in the prophecies of Jeremiah 25 and says, Lord, it's time to be restored now. So he's putting Isaiah 45:11 into practice. I have made the earth, created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens. Verse 13, I have raised him. You ever wondered who the him is? It's Cyrus. I have raised him up in righteousness. I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city. He shall let go my captives, not for price nor reward, saith the Lord of hosts. So there are 14 verses from the last verse of 44 through the first 13 to 45 that deal specifically with Cyrus and God's plan of what Cyrus is going to do for the nation of Israel. So, with that in mind, turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. We'll see that this is exactly what takes place. You don't have to have a message from Romans 10:17 to build your faith. Faith cometh by hearing the word, and look what God did 150 years in advance. You think he could have planned something 150 years ago so that you bump into it at the right time or miss it at the right time or whatever? Well, certainly he could. He can have everything planned. I mean, everything is planned. Not only can he, it is. How did you get the wife or the husband that you have now? Someone years and years ago had to marry the right person, and they had to marry the right person, they had to marry the right person, or the genes would have been different, and the person would have been a different person. And you would have married someone that you really didn't marry. Well, I hope you followed all of that. 2 Chronicles 36 and verse 20. Well, it builds my faith to see what all God's done in the past.
Amen.
He's got all of his plan and prophesied and called him out by name, Cyrus. Maybe you were called out by name 150 years ago. Some charismatic meeting stuck away somewhere in Africa. The Bushmen got the baptism of the Holy Ghost down there and started prophesying about Cheno Ross. And see, I'll never know about that till maybe the afterlife. Well, I know that sounds way off the deep end. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. We'll just leave it there. At least we've got the Word of God for Cyrus. Verse 20, and them, now this is after destruction of Babylon, them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon.
This message will be continued.